First of all, it should be called the FR Forest Act, F standing for something other than fix, if you know what I mean.
Welcome, wild ones. This is Josh Schlossberg, host of the Green Root Podcast, the official podcast of Eco Integrity Alliance, where we're on a quest to uncover the roots of the ecological crisis. For this episode, we've got Rocky Smith. Rocky Smith moved to Colorado in 1975 and immediately became enamored with the mountain environment. While on a backpacking climbing trip in 1979, he observed recreational abuse and soon learned of plans for massive logging of our national forests. He has been working to protect those lands ever since. Welcome, Rocky, back to the Green Root Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Josh. Appreciate it. I love being here.
Really glad you're here and glad you're in Colorado. So Rocky is a person that I work closely with on forest issues across the West, but also here in Colorado. He's down in Denver. I'm up in the hills hiding out from the world. And is it accurate to call you a forest management analyst or consultant? Is that a proper title?
Yes, I've used both. I do consulting, or at least that's one way to describe it. Various groups hire me to analyze a project or something that they don't have the time or the inclination to get into. And I analyze stuff all the time. I read the Fix Our Forest Act, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and other acts and regulations and policies. So yeah, I'm an analyst and a consultant.
Yeah, Rocky is my go-to person to make sense of the legalese or legislativese, whatever the language is there. I talk to Rocky about that because he's got a really good head for that. It's that stuff is a little trickier for me to absorb. So yeah, Rocky is a longtime expert on these issues and is a staunch protector of forests, which is why we have him on to talk about something that is perhaps one of the greatest threats in a long list of them to our public forests, which is called the Orwellian. I always have to use that term, or at least quotes, Fix Our Forests Act. And as everyone knows, it's pretty much always the opposite of what they claim. So tell folks, Rocky, how awesome is the Fix Our Forests Act?
Well, first of all, it should be called the FR Forest Act, F standing for something other than fix, if you know what I mean. It's a little bit of background. It's a long bill, 176 pages that I just finished reading this morning. The House has passed a shorter version of it. That was, I think, only 134 pages. I also looked on the web this morning and I could not find the Senate version. Someone sent it to me a week or so ago, and I've been reading it ever since. It's taken me that long to get through it. So I don't know if it's actually been introduced in the Senate yet, but I'm sure it will be if it hasn't already. And
It has been introduced in the Senate as of last week from a cotillion of Western senators, including Colorado's Senator Hickenlooper or Hickenlooper.
yeah, okay, that's good. Yeah, Hickenlooper is one of the at least four sponsors. And okay, well, I'll get right into it here, and stop me anytime and make a comment or ask questions, Josh. But this would do a lot of things. It has a lot of provisions. The ones of most interest to us are ones that would directly affect how our forests are managed, logging, especially, and burning. Not all of which is 100% bad, but the way it's going to be done under this bill really has us concerned. It would start with the designation of forest or fireshed management areas. That would the initial designation would be the high-risk fire sheds that the Forest Service identified in its wildfire crisis strategy in January of 2022. There is a map with that document, which can be found online, or I could send it to anyone who wants it. And it covers a good part of the West, covers the northern and central front range of Colorado, lots of California, parts of most of the other Western states. And then there will also be, as an initial designation of fireshed management areas, the top 20% of all the firesheds, some 7,000 they've identified, top 20% for wildfire exposure and watershed risk and things like that. And these areas would be the focus of fireshed management projects, which could be just about anything: logging, burning, thinning, you name it, they could do it. The Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management are encouraged to designate areas for emergency management. Now, the Forest Service did that in a action separate from this. The secretary issued a memo, or rather the Secretary of Agriculture issued a memo that said everything's an emergency. And you look at the map and it appears to cover just about the entire national forest system that has any trees on it at all, including wilderness areas. Now, the Forest Service later clarified that it doesn't cover wilderness areas, but they did not reissue the map and did not issue an official. That was just a statement somebody made. They didn't issue a new memo or a corrected memo. So the emergency declaration could apply to just about anything. For the Fix Our Forest Act, the agencies, Forest Service and the BLM, are encouraged strongly to use existing authorities, and there's a number of them. A number of acts have been passed over the last, going back to the 2014 Farm Bill, that have made certain projects over a certain amount of area, a certain amount of acres. They allow the agencies to do them by issuing a categorical exclusion. In other words, under NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, they do not have to do an environmental assessment or environmental impact statement. That's really concerning because, the categorical exclusions are meant for really minor stuff that doesn't cause any impacts, like painting the fence at the district ranger's office or something like that. It's not meant for huge projects, but there's all sorts of things in the amendments to the Healthy Forest Management Act over the years that have allowed areas up to 3,000 acres, that's quite a bit of land, to be excluded from documentation under NEPA. There was one that was 4,500 acres. That's for mule deer and greater sage grouse habitat. The Fix Our Forest Act would up those. The 4,500 acres would be 7,000, and all the 3,000 ones, and there's about 6 of them, would be 10,000 acres. In other words, 10,000 acre projects. That's 15.6 square miles, a little over that, could be approved without any environmental documentation, no consideration of the impacts or ways to implement them or to mitigate them while you implement them. Public involvement would be limited to an initial comment period. The public would not be able to administratively challenge, as they can now in some cases. An administrative challenge is you ask a higher officer within the Forest Service to modify or overturn the lower officer's decision, and it sometimes results in improved projects. Usually it doesn't, but anyway, that is gone. And there are some other things here. They up the definition of hazard trees for those areas along power lines. Anything that's if a tree could anywhere could fall within 150 feet of a power line, it could be cut. That whole area could be cut. Now, there are no trees in Colorado that are 150 feet tall. And no, we don't want trees falling on power lines, but we also don't want wide swaths of clear-cut land along power lines when you don't need anywhere near that wide of a cut area to protect the power line. But there would be up to 150 feet along power lines and 300 feet along Forest Service roads. Okay, and for the 300 feet along Forest Service roads, there would be a categorical exclusion up to 6,000 acres. Okay, that's another big chunk of land where a project could be done, could be approved without any consideration of its potential impacts. So, I mean, that's pretty serious right there. Now, there's a couple of other things. One is that this one is really crazy. Livestock raising could be allowed specifically for the purpose of fuel reduction, of fire risk reduction. Now, to preface this, I need to say that there aren't very many acres of national forest land where livestock raising is not allowed. If there's vegetation on there they allow, that doesn't mean it's all grazed. Some of it is, a permittee or potential permittee would go up there and say, oh, no, there's not enough for them to eat. I don't want to have this allotment. But this would specifically allow grazing for the purpose of fire risk reduction, and the Secretary of Agriculture will develop a strategy for that. And I think I've got this quote correct. I'm going to read it here. Livestock grazing could be used for post-fire restoration and recovery, unquote. Now that is really crazy. If you know anything about livestock grazing, it can do tremendous damage to our rangelands. Now, it doesn't always, it depends on how much the animals are moved around, if they're kept out of the riparian areas mostly, and what the stocking is and what the season is. But on a post-fire landscape, it's very, very fragile. You need to let it recover on its own. Or if you need to, go in and throw some seed or something of native species, but you don't want 1,000-pound animals jumping around on there, compacting the soil, hindering the recovery and the revegetation. Also, you think, well, cows will eat grass, that'll reduce the fire, right? Well, maybe in the short term, if it nudes the landscape, there's no vegetation, nothing can burn. But also, cows are known to, like I say, denude areas, and what comes in? Weeds like Bromus tectorum, which is more commonly known as cheatgrass. Cheatgrass is a very devilish weed that plagues western rangelands. Why? Because it takes over and because it burns readily. And what comes back after a pasture full of cheatgrass burns? More cheatgrass. So that's a really, I just think, idiotic provision of the Fix Our Forest Act. There's another provision. This one's minor, but it shows how way off this act is. It would allow stewardship contracts. Stewardship contracts are a special kind of federal contracts that allow things that would be illegal under other forms of federal contracting, like trading goods for services. Like if, for example, the Forest Service wanted to hire somebody to obliterate some roads, and they say, well, you should cut these trees, you can keep the trees, you can keep the wood, and we won't charge you for them if you close these roads. So sometimes that's okay thing to do. But under these stewardship contracts, first of all, they were increased to a maximum length of 20 years. That's a long time for a contract. Right now, they're 5 to 10 years. And stewardship contracts would be specifically allowed. Let me see if I can find that quote, to restore and expand forest product infrastructure. In other words, stewardship contracts could be let by the federal government for the specific purpose of keeping timber mills in business. Now, there is a socioeconomic aspect of forest management, and it should be considered, but trees should never be sold for the specific purpose of just keeping a business in business. That's just wrong. So, I mean, that's some pretty crazy stuff, but there's more. Not done yet. I know, it's crazy. This one's been in the works for a long time. It's been proposed in Congress after what was called the Cottonwood decision, which required the federal government to, excuse me, consult on forest plans after there was a change in information about endangered species. Under the Endangered Species Act, when there is anything, a forest plan or a project or anything that might affect an endangered species or a threatened species or its critical habitat, the agency, the Forest Service, the BLM in this case, must consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service, or for ocean-going critters, the National Marine Fisheries Service. This law, the federal Fix Our Forest Act, would remove that when there is new information or when a new species is listed or critical habitat is designated. In other words, if there was a forest plan or BLM resource management plan in place, and then a species was listed or critical habitat was designated, or there was new information about what kind of trouble that species was in, or what kind of things it really doesn't like or does like, there wouldn't have to be any additional consultation. And again, that's just wrong. Endangered and threatened species are already on the edge of their existence, and we should do everything we can within reason, without causing too many other problems, to facilitate their recovery to full viable populations. This thwarts that, and there's no reason to do it. You should consult no matter what, if there's going to be an effect, a possible adverse effect on those species. So that's in summary, the Fix Our Forest Act. It's just a horrible thing, and the fact that it's already passed the House with about 60 some Democratic votes, in addition to almost all Republicans, and the fact that at least one Democratic senator, Senator John Hickenlooper here in Colorado, has sponsored the Senate bill. I think it's pretty likely this thing's going to pass. I think what it's going to take is a massive outcry of people, just barraging their senators and saying, don't pass this, and pointing out how it cuts the public out, how it could lead to just massive cutting. And we'll also want to talk about what is really going to, possibly, excuse me, help reduce fire damage. And that is what the science clearly shows is treat in the home ignition zone, not miles into the backcountry. You treat in the areas that are most likely to ignite the home. And that's a distance of about 30 meters. It's actually, according to science, probably less than that, but 30 meters, which is about 98 feet, provides a safety margin. In other words, get everything out of that, or almost everything that's flammable. Have nothing flammable up against the house. The house itself can't be flammable, or any other structure, a garage, a business, a town, or whatever you're looking to protect. Just remove the flammable material from there, and don't have a flammable roof, of course, and put screens on the windows so that burning embers don't fly through them. Also on your vents. That's going to do a heck of a lot more to protect our infrastructure, our built infrastructure, than something like what could be done under the Fix Our Forest Act, where you could cut thousands or hundreds of thousands of acres or millions in the backcountry, at great detriment to all the things we want our forests for. Biodiversity, the web of life, habitat. You don't have large areas like we have on national forests on private land, with a few exceptions like Ted Turner's ranches. I think he manages those to maintain wildlife, although he does run bison. But our national forests are critical for all sorts of wildlife species. They're also critical for carbon storage, maintaining the large trees particularly. There is no possible strategy to fight climate change that doesn't include conserving our forests, especially the large trees. And yet the Fix Our Forest Act makes no mention of that. It has one mention of conserving large trees, and that's in the fireshed management assessments for each fireshed management area. Get with the acronyms here and all the terms. A fireshed management assessment is done, and one of the provisions of the assessment is supposed to be considering how to save large trees, but there's even a hedge to that. It says, come up with a strategy to retain large trees, but only if the forest is fire resilient and it's resilient against insects and disease. Now, the way the Forest Service thinks, any tree out there could burn, which is true. Any tree out there could be subject to insect and disease. That's mostly true. But if you take that view, then you could cut anything and never retain anything. And, what's the point? So that and that's only in development of the strategy. It requires no action or prohibits no action by the Forest Service. So that's nothing. And that's the only thing in this whole act about conserving large trees. There's nothing about carbon, or almost nothing about carbon sequestration. There is a little bit in another part of this act is the biochar demonstration program. There's all sorts of things there about how that might be beneficial. I'm not so sure about that. That's not though what I'm really worried about with this, as I've discussed. It's the just carte blanche to go cut everything. Anyway, this act is it's got to die. I hope we can make it die.
Thank you for the overview, Rocky. You're definitely the perfect person for that. And as familiar as I was with many of the details, I was not aware of all of that. So a lot of this, or at least some of that, is news to me, and probably a lot of this, if not all of it, is news to our listeners. So yeah, thank you for the details. It's really interesting that the thing that we know matters for protecting communities from wildfire is home hardening, defensible space, like you said, up to 100 feet around home. My understanding is that there is zero funding in this bill for the number one thing that we know actually works. So this
Right.
idea that this is just the latest in the long list, I would say at least starting from 2003, I guess probably before that, but the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, in quotes from
Mm.
G.W. Bush, using whatever thing they need to exploit, typically wildfire, to get out the cut. And here's, I guess, a silver lining. Like, yes, let's hope that it doesn't pass. Um, what I'll say is, yeah, so here in Colorado, Eco Integrity Alliance, we were able to get 24 Colorado conservation groups to sign on to a letter saying, Hickenlooper, don't introduce this bill. He did it anyway. So right now it is up to the larger environmental groups to address this. They have been somewhat, I would say not enough to push back on this. So hopefully they will, but let's just say, let's say it passes. I'm just going right into the worst case scenario. Now, first of all, people should be contacting their elected officials. We're encouraging that. We're helping to facilitate that for sure, all that. But here is something I'm curious about what you think, Rocky. Let's say it does pass. In some ways, a silver lining may be that the cat will be fully out of the bag in terms of the fraudulence of the idea of cutting forests for quote, wildfire mitigation, that they've been so naked with this, with Trump's executive order to increase timber production and claiming in that, yeah, wildfire is the reason we're using for this. The subsequent memo, as you mentioned, from the Secretary of Agriculture that came out just after, maybe less than a month after, saying we are going to designate, I think the numbers are actually 112 million acres, so
Mhm.
59% of national
Yeah,
forest,
all right.
specifically putting them on the chopping block uh, under the guise of wildfire, right after Trump says, hey, we need more timber. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh, all of this needs wildfire logging. So I would say the one positive thing is that many of us have been calling attention to this for years, ad nauseum. They're exploiting wildfire. They're exploiting the fake euphemisms of forest health and insects and all sorts of other things. And a lot of times people don't quite believe us. A lot of the large environmental groups are saying, well, you're exaggerating. Of course, the people who want to log this are just saying that we're lying, that there's no science, even though there are hundreds of studies, peer-reviewed studies that contest this. So I think now we finally might be at the point where the mainstream public is realizing they can no longer, these agencies, the corporations, the media, the elected officials can no longer pretend that this isn't just a load of BS. Would you say that at least that might be a positive?
Maybe a little bit, but I think a lot of people already know, but maybe not enough know. I mean, the people that look at this do know, but not enough of them do. And I agree with you that the national groups haven't come out strongly enough on this, and they need to do more, and they need to make it a top priority. Um, yes, the Forest Service, ever since I started looking at national forest management back in the 1980s, in those days, timber was big. I mean, they had lots of appropriations for to cut timber and to build roads. And they would always say that, oh, we want a healthy forest. And they wouldn't define what that is. A healthy forest, in my mind, is one that nature manages and that humans mostly stay out of. And that includes some dead trees because death is a part of life, if you want to look at it that way. So maybe it fully exposes them. I think another possible positive in this is that we've got all this stuff out there. We have the Trump executive order. We have the um, memo from the Secretary of Agriculture, and then we have a memo from the Associate Chief saying cut, 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 and do all sorts of stuff. Well, we need the lumber, we need this, we need that. But the Forest Service has uh, fired, or the Trump administration has fired so many people that I don't know if there's going to be enough people to carry it out. Did we just lose the video here? No, there it is. And also there was all sorts of money appropriated under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, a little bit under the Budget Reconciliation Act for carrying out a lot of the proposals that were, that got categorical exclusions. In other words, the thins, the fuel reductions, the burns. Now, if that could be rescinded, and it could be by a simple vote from the Congress, then the president would sign it, and that money would be gone. If it's not gone, then that money's still there, but I don't know if they're going to have the people to carry it out, because someone has to administer the Forest Service timber sales. They have to sign a document, even if they don't have to do the environmental review because it's under a categorical exclusion, excuse me. Someone's got to do that. Someone's got to go out and, do something, mark the trees. Although, unfortunately, this is another thing. Under the secretary's order, it's the chief's order, or associate chief's order, the Forest Service would use designation by description and designation by prescription. What are those? Boiled down to, it means that instead of marking the trees, the Forest Service would allow, with a little bit of guidance, the timber operator to go mark his own trees to cut. Now, if that isn't tailor-made for abuse, I don't know what is. So that's another thing we got to watch out for. I don't think there's much positive here, but maybe the thing you identified, Josh, and maybe the fact that they won't be able to carry out all these grand schemes because there won't be enough people, or won't be enough money. Maybe, we'll see. Anyway, it's going to be a rough 4 years, and we better hope that we get a more favorable Congress in the 2026 elections, and a obviously much better president after the 2028 election.
Thank you for all of that. So, of course, we are encouraging people to call your senators, email, send a form letter, petition, share this damn podcast, all the above. So this is not me just capitulating, but I am trying to acknowledge that a lot of these bills have passed in the past, and this is a likely one to pass as well, barring a real change in the discussion and dialogue and a lot of things such as better media coverage and the large environmental groups kind of stepping it up a little bit. But I think that's a really good point about Trump yanking the funding, because he's just running around like a bull in a china shop. He may be hamstringing himself by cutting a lot of the funding. It's pretty funny. He's both saying, let's expand logging, and then he's actually taking the money away from doing that. So that's pretty sweet. We have a project that probably don't need to get into in depth, but that's up here in Colorado called the Lower North South Vegetation Management, euphemism, whatever. And that is 116,000 acres, and it's under that emergency authorization that many of us have been crowing about for a couple years, because that's been almost 1 million acres across the West. And really, we haven't got a lot of traction in terms of, say, media coverage or even larger environmental groups kind of paying attention to that specific aspect. But now that 112 million acres is using that whole excuse, I think people are going to call more attention to that. But I would say, so some of the positives also, besides potentially the cutting of the funding, is that a lot of folks, well, let me frame this as a question instead of just me ranting. So do you feel like people would be more likely to fight what is going on in terms of logging in the forest, which we have to acknowledge has been going on under Democrats as well? Do you think they're more likely to fight it because we can point to Trump and Republicans?
Possibly. I mean, that's going to depend on how good a job we do, we and the national groups, in talking about, this is happening in part because of Trump, but also in part because of Democratic votes in the past for the CEs for 3,000 acres, which would be 10,000 acres, or 7,000 acres, 7,500 acres under FOFA, Fix Our Forest Act. Maybe we can reach a critical mass somehow if this really gets going. In other words, if the people are available and there's lots of funding, if that becomes available, say a couple of years from now, and people see their favorite hunting ground, or they're hiking, where they go hiking, or where they walk the dog, or whatever, maybe that ignites the critical mass that helps in the next Congress, if we get a favorable Congress, to knock some of this stuff out. But it's going to be very hard to reverse, because the Democrats, as well as the Republicans are worse, of course, but the Democrats have drank the Kool-Aid. They've consumed the Kool-Aid that says our forests are really dense because of lack of fire, because of fire suppression, and therefore we have to cut them. That is not true over most of the national forest system. And also it ignores the incredible value of forests. Yes, forests are going to burn. They burn because they're meant to. It's part of their, if you will, metaphorical DNA. It's just like they get stuff out of the roots. They use sunshine. They burn. Except with the possible exception of cottonwood forest, every ecological type in Colorado burns. I think we have to educate people about how important forests are, how fires are, yes, they can be destructive, but we can protect our fires, our homes from fire by treating in the home ignition zone. And the federal government can play a role in that by issuing grant money, siphoned down through the state and what's it called, the Division of the Forest Service, state and local forestry, and through state forest services, and through counties and through homeowners associations and everything. And we can ignite that firestorm. In other words, protect from fire. There's the firestorm to do it. I'm hoping, because otherwise we're going to see our forests wasted. And it's really a shame because they're just so important in ways that the average person doesn't seem to understand. We got to change that.
Absolutely. And of course, many of us have been speaking up on this for decades, but it's tough to get out there, of course, because our opponents have the perfect excuse. You can ramp up the fear of fire, wildfire hysteria. It's an emotional thing. Who wants to die in a fire? Well, we can figure it out. Look, all we got to do is cut down all of our forests and you're safe. There are, of course, alternative bills. Representative Huffman's bill out of out of California is one that would focus on the things that actually matter. And it's incredible how we can't push forward the thing that actually matters about wildfire across the US, which is the home hardening defensible space up to 100 feet around homes. So there are bills out there, but a lot of elected officials are more interested in this splashy thing, I suspect, because then they can say, look, we did a thing. You see that ugly patch of former forest? That's us protecting you. Like, they can say they did a thing, they just throw a bunch of money at it, and then they can sleep at night or whatever. But what's interesting about Fix Our Forest Act is it's so bad that even some of the biggest champions in the Congress for logging on the Democratic side, which is Senator Ron Wyden in Oregon and Representative Joe Neguse here in Colorado, so they actually oppose the bill. So Wyden spoke out very strongly against at least the House version. Of course, he's in the Senate. And Joe Neguse did not vote for it. So Joe Neguse has been pushing unscientific rhetoric in favor of cutting forests. Even he's like, whoa, 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 hold on, this goes too far. So that should say something. But again, encourage people to engage in the democratic process. I believe in it less and less, but I still participate in it, and I still believe people should participate in it. So I'm just stating my honest opinion of my cynicism, but that is not an excuse to not engage in it. It is not an excuse to not contact your senators, and we're putting out all the conduits for doing that. So I want to make that very clear. Folks need to do that. But I wonder if things might need to get worse before they get better. That I still think your average American doesn't realize how bad this can get and might get. They haven't necessarily seen it with their own eyes, which is why I've worked a lot in local counties on county open space, because these are parks kind of not super far from where people live, as opposed to national forests, which can be a bit more far flung. And people are seeing, oh my, this is what, quote, wildfire mitigation looks like, clear cutting the entirety almost of my favorite trail, cutting the largest trees in the forest. So what do you think about that idea of it needing to get worse before it gets better to really wake people up?
I think you may be onto something there, although it's gotten pretty bad already with the categorical exclusion, at least what they can do. And they've started to carry out that, and you've been, watching that, Josh, with all the projects that are done under the emergency authority. But maybe it does have to get worse. Maybe more people have to see that their favorite spot gets nuked before they rise up in anger. I don't know. That's pretty bad. I mean, that sometimes happens. Like if you look at what happened with the Civil Rights Act, and I was in high school at the time. The horrible incident in 1965 when the state troopers and local cops just beat the hell out of protesters on a bridge in Selma, Alabama, and that led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act later that year. Now we had a president who was very favorable, and we had enough people in Congress outside the South that was favorable. So the conditions were right there, but that's kind of what it took. It was a horrible, horrible incident. Maybe that's what this will take. Maybe that's what it's going to take to get people to understand the importance of our forests. They just think a tree is a tree, you cut it down, it grows back up, right? Well, that's a to the extent that's even true, you lose so much when you cut down a tree. It's going to be a long time before that tree stores as much carbon as was in there, or it provides the type of habitat it was providing, and how it protects the watershed that it lies in. And maybe that's just what it takes. We'll see. I wish we didn't have to see it. I wish we could have a bill that would pass the Congress and be signed by whoever was president, that said our forests are to be protected. And yes, we have to do a little bit of logging. And yes, we'll do some, minor fire mitigation work where it's going to really be effective in protecting infrastructure. But until we can get to that stage, we've got to suffer through this and try to keep rousing the public to get them riled up to get some changes. And it's going to be quite a task.
I agree, and of course, I'm not advocating that the bill be passed or even resigned to it. I'm just kind of looking at big picture, long term, and yeah, I do almost think people need to, unfortunately, lose a precious place to them to actually engage. And I don't want this to happen, but if that's the only way, then hopefully we can take advantage of that momentum. And yeah, I mean, at Eco Integrity Alliance, we've been talking for a while about public lands as biodiversity and climate preserves, the idea of these areas being protected because they're our last best ecosystems. And I would say that this wildfire pretense logging is the single greatest threat to them because it can touch any forest anywhere at any time of any size. And we should probably wrap up, but because this has been great and this is a lot of important information, but I wanted to ask you something. So we've talked a lot on this podcast for sure about wildfire, how important wildfire is, and the fear of it is overblown. And we know the things that we can do, and it's protecting around the communities. So we've talked all about that plenty of time. But I want to ask you this. So why should a well-meaning person who cares about environmental issues, why should they bother caring about forests? Like, shouldn't they be worried about climate, and shouldn't they spend more time anyway on social causes anyway and not worry about? So why care about forests?
Well, as I've said, forests do so much for us. They produce oxygen, take out carbon dioxide. With a proper program, they could really be a hedge against climate change. They provide for wildlife that, like bears, grizzly bears, black bears, that really couldn't live anywhere else. Goshawk would be another species that has a territory of a couple thousand acres at least. And the web of life, it's a hard concept to explain, especially as someone who hasn't studied biology or anything like that. But and actually, I don't know how I'd explain it to someone who didn't have some background knowledge. But I mean, the forests are so important. I mean, there's all sorts of science on that, you know, and it directly affects human lives with, production of oxygen and the maintenance of wildlife habitat. For example, if you hunt, you're going to have good forests for that. If you fish, fishing streams run through national forest and BLM land. If you just like to observe wildlife, if that's your thing, I enjoy doing that. When I go out, if I see wildlife, that adds to my experience. Without national forests or national forests all cut down, you're only going to see a few species that can adapt to any habitat. I mean, it does affect people, but it's hard to convince them of it. And I don't know that I know how to convince them of it, but we should care because forests support us all. They support life on Earth, literally, and we must defend them and protect them and maintain them.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And I guess I'll ask a trickier question and answer this as you see fit. Do you feel, and if you do feel this way, why do you think this has happened? Why do you think potentially that the larger mainstream environmental movement has sort of, I don't want to say abandoned forest protection, but made it a pretty low priority. And when they even engage in it, it's in a pretty half-assed way. So if assuming you believe in that, you might not believe that perspective. But just what's your take on my controversial
Well,
question?
you and I, Josh, among others, have criticized for a long time, at least among ourselves, if not publicly, some of the actions or lack of actions by the major groups. They seem to sometimes be more interested in making a deal with the land management agencies, with people who would cut down our forests. I mean, there's plenty of examples of that with at least medium-sized groups and large groups making deals with loggers. And I'm not saying loggers are evil, okay? Just that, they have a different view of forests than we do. They see them as sources of profits. We see them as sources of life and of fighting climate change. And it's, I've worked for nonprofit organizations a good part of my adult life, and I understand the importance of fundraising and the difficulty. I always work for small groups. The largest budget of a group I ever worked for was maybe not even $200,000, whereas that would be a pittance now. I mean, the annual budget of the Wilderness Society, I'll bet you is several hundred million or over 100, not maybe 100 million, but many, many, many tens of millions. Okay. And you're kind of in a different world when you're that. You're far away from the ground, you're far away from your roots, and it's just too easy to compromise and forget how you got there and forget what's important. It becomes maintaining the organization becomes the most important thing instead of saving the forest. And that, is just not good. I'm always going to be wanting to save the forest. I'll work with anyone who wants to save the forest, which includes, but isn't limited to, large groups, medium-sized groups, small groups, individuals, radicals, not violent ones. I don't associate with them, but anybody who wants to work hard and maintain our forest, because that's what we need to do. And anyone that doesn't want to do it and that calls himself an environmentalist, I would say, why? Why can you not see this? I would question them about their motives. Is your big salary and your big office in a Washington, D.C. Big building, is that more important than what happens on the ground, out in the forest, out in the streams, in the air, in the soil? Look at your priorities and see what's important and act accordingly. And I don't know if that would change anybody, but I would hope it will in sometime in the future.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I totally agree. One last question for you. So this bill is called Fix Our Forests, or as you say, F Our Forests, which is more accurate. But this whole idea that our forests are broken, all that sort of stuff, what do you think about the thing that's really broken is our connection to the natural world, to nature? And if you think that that is something that actually needs fixing, do you have any insight on how we might be able to get your average individual to be repairing their connection to the natural world so they'll care about all this stuff more, they'll engage more, and we can actually stop these terrible bills before they're even bubbling up?
I agree that that's what we need to do. I mean, here in the Western world, in a highly capitalistic society, I mean, you can say that capitalism has some benefits, but one of its big detriments is that it looks at everything as a commodity. Can I make money out of it? Now, if a forest that we don't log and we don't have industrial scale recreation on, nobody's going to make a lot of money out of that, and yet it's still priceless for all the benefits that we've been talking about. And we need to get people to see that. You hear sometimes of people talk about kids having nature deficit disorder, which I think is an excellent term. They look at their screens too much. They don't even talk to each other. They don't get outside. When I was young, I'd go outside and play. I really love the outdoors, and that's in part why when I came out here, I got into the mountains, which led to my career in protecting forests. It was a long story, long gap in there, but that's what led to it. Now we're not having that. And you can approach it from an academic thing, and we should do that to show people the forest. I got a little bit of that in biology class, I remember, as a sophomore in high school. The food web, for example, and importance of predation, things like that. We did talk about that. We did study that. That should be stepped up. But other than that, I don't really have any insight on how to do it, because if you look at the average, so-called average middle class person, he or she is concerned about feeding the family, which they have to be. And they may not have time for musing about, well, we got to save our forests. I mean, if they have a strong personal belief, if they are a hunter or a fisher person or a hiker or a peak bagger like I was, maybe they then, that gets them to protect the forest. But the average person who doesn't go to the forest very often doesn't understand why it's important to save them. I don't know how you get them to do it. It's just not easy, because there's so much to focus on now. People are really concerned about Trump's tariffs, as they should be. They're concerned about civil rights, people getting snatched off the streets. We should be real concerned about that. So I don't know how you elevate this to the top level of importance where it needs to be, not to dismiss or degrade all the other concerns, a few of which I just mentioned. We live in tough times, and the hits against our forests are just one of those really problematic areas. And I wish I had a better answer for you, Josh, but I don't. We just got to keep on keeping on and do what we can do, and recognize that we're only two people, you and I, and lots of our compatriots. And maybe we can someday, before we die, get our forests the respect that they deserve. I hope.
Well, that is the vision. That's the mission. And I think getting people out into the forest. I mean, you did mention the nature deficit disorder. So it seems clear that getting people in the forest more and more, and that's something that I'm trying to focus on a bit more. I definitely want to talk to people about the science and the details behind it. All that's crucial. But I think that pales in comparison to just walking out in the forest and smelling that kind of spicy, almost burnt pine smell, and just feeling the breeze and listening to the streams. So any ways we can get people out there. My ideas of mandatory hikes, that's not gone over well with people. So I guess we just have to keep that voluntary, and we'll keep brainstorming about ways to get people to reconnect. And yeah, thank you so much, Rocky, for coming on, talking about this awful bill, and for all the work that you're doing and have done and will do for the natural world. So thank you, Rocky.
Well, thanks for having me on, and I'm happy to talk to you anytime, Josh, and thanks again for having me on your program.
Absolutely.